welcome to the RINGO community gathering. Lovely to see you all joining. Great to see familiar names, some unfamiliar names. Welcome everyone. This is RINGO and a conversation on untying aid. It's really great to see our numbers diving up. I'm Jenny. I'm going to be your host for this conversation. Really nice to have you here. We will just take a minute or so to let everybody join. So welcome to the call.
If you'd like to put your name and where you're calling from in the chat, it would be lovely to see where everyone is joining us from, which parts of the world.
Welcome everybody as you're joining, new people arriving all the time. We've had a huge amount of interest in this call, so it's going to be a good one. So yeah, really great to have you all with us. Welcome. We're just waiting for people to arrive and to get a full house before we dive into the content. So it's great to have you here. As Sparkle says, please pop in the chat your name, where you're calling from, how you're feeling today. Just feel free to introduce yourself, the organization, and how you're arriving. Great to have you here. Always very exciting on these global calls to just see the range of locations and environments people are joining from. Really wonderful. It's the richness of this community and of what we all bring from different places. So that's exciting to watch that conversation bubbling up. Brilliant. And please feel free to change your name as well to just make sure that that represents how you want to be referred to, whether that be pronouns or name. Just make sure that's accurate reflection for you and how you want to join the call. Wonderful. It looks like we have a strong old group of people on the call. Really, pretty full house. So I think we will dive in and get started. So my name's Jenny Richmond. I'm just hosting this call on behalf of the RINGO team, part of the RINGO core team that has been on this journey this last 3 years. Some of you are very familiar with RINGO and some of you may be new to us. So we'll tell you a little bit about who we are and what we've been thinking about sort of during the call. We have these community gatherings periodically, and we love getting together with this broad community. We get amazing numbers of people and range of experience on these calls. The intention of them is really to connect, to just keep strengthening each other and strengthening the collective community that we are of people who are interested in transforming civil society and strengthening civil society in working in our different places in the world for that purpose. And on each of the calls, we had our last one in January. On each of the calls, we tend to focus in on one of the areas of innovation that we've been exploring as RINGO. So today, it's the topic of untying aid in relation to civil society funding. This is a hot topic. It's really interesting. There's some great range of perspectives on this topic. So we're going to just sort of introduce that, and then we have a wonderful set of speakers who are going to help us to explore it from their different perspectives in the aid system. So we're going to hear from them, and I'll introduce them in a moment. And then we really want to hear from you. We want to have a rich and varied conversation on this call. We want to be open and honest with each other. We want to listen to each other's perspectives, and really stand in solidarity with each other wherever we sit in the aid and civil society and funding ecosystem. So we all bring really different and useful perspectives, and we really value all of those as we go into this conversation. So looking forward to that. So we will have time for Q&A and discussion on the call. Despite being such a big call, we're still going to try and manage that and make space for as many people as possible. So what do we mean by untying aid? Just as a quick intro, obviously this is sort of terminology that's often used really in relation to bilateral and official development assistance. What we're meaning as RINGO and on this call is really looking at civil society funding. That's our particular interest, because RINGO is the reimagination of the INGO and global civil society. That's what we've been exploring through a systems change lens these last 3 years. And that's the sort of the lens through which we want to look at this question of untying aid. So what we mean by untying aid is moving away from the restriction of funds for certain civil society actors. So that's what we're going to explore within the system as a whole. We're going to explore the sort of tying or untying of aid parcels to particular types of civil society actors. So we're talking about principles of equality of access. We're talking about sort of how that policy, or whether it be tied or untying, affects the tapestry of civil society, affects sort of the whole system. So those of you who know RINGO well will know that we have, throughout our process, really wanted to take a systems approach to looking at civil society, where it can be strengthened, and what some of the sort of blockers and areas of stuckness, as we call them, are in sort of furthering and reimagining civil society for the future. So what we want to explore today is sort of how this process of tying aid to certain parts of civil society can have an impact on that whole system, can have an impact on particularly civil society in the global majority world, on local and national civil society, how that plays out, and obviously all of that within a lens of the terminology of decolonization, of localization, and locally led development. So that's how we're coming to the conversation today. It's obviously worth noting that we are sort of having this conversation in the context of some sort of political challenges in a number of different countries, both OECD countries and global South countries, where both civic space is really constrained and turbulent and challenging in a number of places. Some places that is playing out in terms of aid cuts. Some places it's playing out in terms of sort of policy change, in terms of who gets funded and how they get funded. So acknowledging that is a current and sort of quite turbulent context in which we're going to have this conversation today. So that's why we want to just really emphasize that we are coming at it from a sort of solidaristic perspective, that we want to sort of think of it in relation to equity of access, equity of opportunity and funding, and making sure that that funding flows in the most effective way, or in a way that enables civil society to be as effective as possible. So that was just to frame the conversation, really. I think it's going to be a really good one. A couple of practical things before we dive into that conversation. One is we are lucky enough to be accompanied by interpreters today, who will be interpreting into French and Spanish, because the presentations will be in English. But obviously, if people want to raise questions in French and Spanish and have them translated, then please feel free to do so. They are here to facilitate and enable us. We are, as the speakers, are going to try and therefore speak slowly, which I've probably just not done. So if you need interpretation, then at the bottom of your screen, there is an interpretation sort of icon. So please just click on that and choose the language that you need, and put a question in the chat if you have any challenges with that. Sparkle, would you just share our agenda slide for a second? Don't worry if it's not coming up, we can just speak to it. No luck? Okay, don't worry. So, here it comes. Here it comes. So, here's the agenda for today. So we are being welcomed, and I'm setting the framing of the conversation. We're then going to hear from the wonderful Eshban Kwesiga from Uganda, from the Global Fund for Community Foundations. Eshban leads on sort of knowledge functions and influencing within the Global Fund. And he's going to tell us about the really brilliant campaign that he's been leading for the last few weeks on Too Southern to be Funded. Sarah Rose from USAID, Senior Advisor on localization. Really delighted to be joined by you, Sarah. Going to share some perspectives from USAID experience, and your focus on localization there, and some of the sort of tensions and dilemmas from a bilateral funder perspective. And then Romilly Greenhill from Bond UK, which is a network of British overseas development agencies, INGOs, Chief Executive of Bond. Thank you, Romilly, for joining us. And you're going to be a bit of a discussant on the points raised by Eshban and Sarah Rose, and also share some of the UK's experience in this space. We're then going to have space to have a Q&A. Charles is going to then sort of sum up and we've framed it as a call to action for this community. We'll update you a little bit on what RINGO's up to outside of this call, and then we will close, but there will be an option to stay on the call for another 15 minutes or so. If you want to have a more focused conversation with a smaller group, we can go into breakout rooms and continue the conversation if you'd like to. So that's where we're at. Let's dive in. So first activity, before we speak further at you, we want to hear from you. And we have a nice little Zoom poll that is going to be shared now in the chat. So we want to just hear from you on a few questions. So they should pop up. There we go. We'd love to hear a little bit about where your organisation is working, sort of what's your focus? Are you local, national, international? Just to get a sense of who's on the call and the sort of work that you're doing. And then we'd love to hear what's your sense of your understanding of this concept of tied aid. And obviously that will be understood in lots of different ways by each of you. But give us on a scale of 1 to 10 your understanding of the tied aid terminology, and it's wonderful to be able to see that developing before our eyes. And then, do you see untying aid as a positive, negative, or neutral for equitable development? So really great to just dive into the poll there. And Sparkle, I think you were going to just share some reflections as we go. Wonderful. So we can see the answers bubbling up there. Hopefully everyone can see as we go. Sparkle, do you end the poll and then see the final results?
I think Nancy's in charge of this. So here we go. I think I can see that she's going to share the results. So if you scroll down, you should be able to see, so we've got 84% are from international organizations. There's a good range of understanding. There's a few people coming at this very fresh, a few experts in the room, and then there's sort of fairly knowledgeable as we're going. And an overriding majority, 89% of people see untying aid as positive for equitable development.
Thanks, Sparkle. Great. Nice way to kick off. Wonderful. Let's dive into the conversation then. And we are really delighted to be joined by Eshban, Sarah, and Romilly, who I've already introduced. What we're going to do is just hear from all of them in one go. We're going to speak for about 7 to 10 minutes each and share their perspectives, and then we'll dive in. You'll be able to ask them questions. You'll be able to put your perspectives forward. You'll be able to ask questions of the RINGO team more broadly as well. So I will manage that. Fantastic. So I think without further ado, I'm going to introduce Eshban and ask him to share about the campaign that Global Fund for Community Foundations and RINGO and various others have been sort of involved in over the last few weeks. Maybe just to set it within context. So as I explained before, RINGO is a systems change initiative. We went through our early sort of year, well, our first year of being a project, we had something called a social lab where we basically convened a group of people who represented, in a sense, the system of global civil society. So it included from social movements through to funders, through to INGO representatives, through to national and local civil society representatives. So we had this community, many of whom are on this call, who went through a process of inquiry about the sort of the problem that we were trying to look at, which was how to reimagine the global civil society entity in the form of the INGO. And in that process, we identified a number of areas that we felt, we use this term stuckness, which is probably a bit of a challenge for the interpreters. I apologize for that. But areas of blockage, areas of stuckness in the system that were preventing sort of more progressive and reimagined and transformative modes of working. And of course, funding came out really strong, and particularly the sort of scarcity of funding flowing to national and local civil society organizations in comparison with that was going to international, and particularly global south organizations having that scarcity of funding being experienced. So from that identification of the problem, if you like, we identified a potential area that we wanted to innovate on and explore different ways of doing things, which was the concept of untying aid. So sort of the kernel of this idea came through the RINGO process, and then we collaborated with the Global Fund for Community Foundations and others such as Peace Direct are also on the call to really look in more detail at what untying aid might be in relation to civil society funding. So just to give you that context, that's the sort of institutional connection, that's the sort of thought logic coming from the problem identification within the RINGO Social Lab to this innovation, which has turned into now this campaign, which Eshban is going to tell us all about. So I just wanted to sort of locate your words in that context, Eshban. And I'm going to hand over to you for 10 minutes or so. We're in your hands. Thank you so much for joining us.
So thank you, Jenny. Like Jenny said, my name is Eshban Kwesiga from the Global Fund for Community Foundations, and I'm based in Kampala, Uganda. So we are here today to talk about the exclusion of Southern civil society from international funding systems. And when we say Southern or the Global South, what we really mean is the political Global South and not the geographical Global South. We use this as a political term and not a geographical description. I just thought I should start with that because even within international aid circles. Sometimes I just remember the interpreters. Sometimes there is it's not always clear what people mean when they say Global South. So we mean that as a political term and not a geographical description. So many moons ago, Peace Direct commissioned a study to look into the flow of money from international development agencies down to Southern civil society. And our good friend and colleague, Alex Martins, was a researcher that did most of the number crunching and digging through layers and layers of PDFs, produced, the initial makings of the report that later became a campaign, 2000 to be funded. And when it was first presented to us, one of the things that first stood out, or one of the things that we learned, was that only less than 10% of funding from the OECD DAC countries, the Global North Development Agencies, goes to Southern civil society directly. And only about 90% of the other 90% of it has to swim through the network of Northern civil society organizations, other INGOs, before it can get to Southern civil society. And what was also shocking is that we don't know for sure how much of that 90% makes it to the Global South, because the OECD DAC doesn't track that information, and the organizations for which the money goes through haven't been reporting it back. In fact, we put out a reward for $1 billion for anyone who can give us that number. The other thing that we learned was that this system exists because of very systematic laws and policies within these countries that have excluded Southern civil society. But besides the laws and policies, there are also very informal rules of the game and very informal practices that these organizations comply with, and a culture that exists that has also made it systematic that Southern civil society would never access that kind of funding because of this crafty system called Tide Aid. And we call it Tide Aid, and I've just described its characteristics and what we mean. But increasingly, there's a bit of a debate on what to call it, whether Tide Aid, ring-fenced funding. And what we say is that, look, some people have said, look, it looks like Tide Aid, smells like Tide Aid, works like Tide Aid, but really it's not Tide Aid, it's ring-fenced funding. So we're not so hung up on what to call it. We're more hung up on the spirit of the whole thing, which has been the systematic exclusion of Southern civil society from these funding opportunities. And when we launched this campaign, 2000 to be funded, some of the feedback that we got, or in the very makings of that campaign, and I should say that campaign was the work of so many people, and I'm very happy to see so many of them on this call. I wouldn't be able to mention all of them, would need another 3 hours to do that. Part of the feedback that we got was that, look, Southern civil society does not have the capacity to receive direct funding. And we've come to understand that word capacity as a very loaded and coded term with some dog whistle politics around it. Because if at the gist of it, or at the core of it, is the question of trust. If I want to say, I don't trust that organization with money, it's easy for me to code it with that organization doesn't have capacity. And Southern civil society has grown to reject that framing that they don't have the capacity to do this work. So when we first came across this information, we presented it to the community, the Shift the Power community, and other organizations within the movement. And there was a shared understanding that it would make the makings of the campaign, which is 2000 to be funded. And we found that name to be apt because the information that it revealed showed indeed that there is a culture and some of the sensibilities within international organizations that some civil society organizations are indeed 2000 to be funded. And the campaign was meant to accomplish two things. The first is to build a political awareness within Southern civil society on the conditions, circumstances, maybe even false global solidarity that it has to operate with. The second was to start a grown-up conversation on a nuanced and grown-up conversations on what is the right thing for people in Northern civil society, INGOs, good people in problematic systems. What is the right thing for them to do with this information? And I have to say that across Southern civil society, that there's a growing fatigue of constantly having to engage international organizations to say, do better, give us room, like, like fighting and begging for room at the table. And I think that increasingly that fatigue has transitioned into an awareness that instead of fighting for room at that table, that perhaps what we need to be doing is systematically building our own table. And we saw a bit of this at the Shift the Power Summit in Bogota last year in December. Bogota, 700 people and organizations from around the world came down to Bogota to continue the conversation of articulating what a system, what a new system would look like, a system that's not defined by power, that's not defined by money, or that's not defined by the competition of international resources. And anyone who was there, I think, will say that it was a very warm coming together of people united in that idea to build a new system away from the system that has, I think, like turned us against each other. And by us, I mean Northern civil society and Southern civil society, fighting over these resources and beefing over these resources. So I hope that that gives you the makings of what this campaign was like. I thought that I should use perhaps the time that I have left to say something about the present and future circumstances in which civil society operates, and to kind of expand the conversation a bit beyond Tide Aid. I think that for anyone that's following civil society around the world, you might agree that increasingly, especially in places with a shrinking civic space, it's become harder for international organizations to move the resources and the money that we are now talking about. That the reality of civil society across the world, and for states or countries with a shrinking civic space, is that they're thinking creatively on how to undermine the flow of those resources. We see this in India, we see this in my own country, Uganda, more recently, Georgia. Many INGOs have already closed in India. In Uganda, they've just passed a law that makes queer funding illegal. And by extension, that law also sweeps up many feminist organizers and many feminist organizing. Recently in Georgia, there's a proposed law that says that 20%, if 20% of your funding comes from international organizations, that you'd be labeled and targeted as a foreign agent. So all this to say is that across the world, the space for civil society is shrinking. And like a friend said some weeks ago, in some places it has actually already closed. And that one of the, I think, successes of the international system is that it has created a world in which it's almost impossible for us to imagine, a future in which the system has robbed us of our imagination, that it's almost impossible for us to imagine a future in which international resources are not the dominant funding source for local civil society. That when you think about it, you're like, oh, will that ever really happen? And I think that's really one of the successes of this international system, to rob us of our imagination. So I just want to say that in the spirit of global solidarity, some of which, by the way, we felt in the course of running this campaign, that there have been moments when that global solidarity has been missing, when the North has expected Southern civil society to show up for issues that matter to them, but has not showed up for issues that matter to Southern civil society. That in the spirit of global solidarity, I think that there's something to be said about those who are interested in funding local organizations, thinking about investing in the systems that are already there and the local resources that could someday hold civil society when the international flows have become not just difficult, but impossible. And I think that when you look around the world, that this is not just a future that we are theorizing on. This is not just a possible future that might come. In fact, that this is a future that's already here. So as I close all this, I think that the thought that I would hope to leave behind is that those interested in funding, on top of tying aid, which I think that is a conversation that we're already starting, that those interested in funding local organizations have to think about building on local systems that were already there and the local resources that will someday hold civil society when international funding has become impossible or when international funding has become difficult. Yeah. Thank you for listening to me.
Wonderful, Eshban. Thank you so much. As we expected, that's really stimulating, provoking. I love the challenge to us all to sort of really reimagine and really think about what the system could look like if we didn't have a case of depending on international resources purely and sort of necessarily. So yeah, great food for thought. Thank you. We're going to move straight on to Sarah then. Sarah, welcome. And please feel free to just dive in and share your reflections to add to what Eshban has put on the table.
Thank you so much. Thank you first to RINGO for holding this conversation today. Thanks to you, Jenny, and for inviting me to be a part of it. Eshban and Romilly, it's really a privilege to be able to hear from you today, and I am very much looking forward to how this conversation evolves. When Jenny invited me to participate in this, she suggested that, there was a lot of interest in exploring the connections between, untying aid and localization, and what are the opportunities and constraints of a bilateral funder like USAID in this area. How do we think about open competition or untying aid and balance with any commitments we might have to domestic constituencies as well. So I think that's a great topic of conversation, and I'm really excited to talk about it because as many of you may know, shifting funding and decision-making power to local actors is really one of USAID's top reform priorities. I really love how Eshban put it there at the end of his remarks. How do we think about investing in the resources that are already there? And I think that really just captures the heart and spirit of the importance of this. Within USAID, we talk about our reform effort as localization. And when we talk about that, we're talking about the steps that we are taking as an agency to ensure that our work really embraces and reflects local knowledge, local priorities, and looks to strengthen local systems. And so we are working towards two agency-wide targets. The first is about funding. We want to shift a quarter of our funding to local partners. And the second is about how we look more broadly at local leadership, right? How can we ensure local leadership over design, implementation, and how we define and measure results for the majority of our programs? And so over the last year, USAID has really undertaken a wide range of efforts, right, to advance locally led development and humanitarian response. We've worked on developing new tools and resources to support staff to work in more locally led ways. We have reduced barriers to entry for local partners through things like increased outreach, expanded use of local languages, more flexible, more tailorable pre-award assessments, and things like that. And we're also focused on being a better partner, right? By expanding the use of mechanisms with lower compliance burdens, taking steps to support partners' full cost recovery, and encouraging our staff to reduce reporting burdens. And so I'm happy to go into any more detail about any of that during the discussion if it's of interest, but I really want to focus on the question of the day, which is about untying aid. So USAID's money is primarily untied in terms of the type or the nationality of partners that we fund. There are some exceptions, right? We have a federal requirement around a specific percentage of our contract funding going to US-based small businesses. That's one of the main ones. But this is just for acquisition mechanisms or contracts, which include things like staff support contracts. So bear with me for a minute. I'm going to go into some detailed distinctions. But acquisition, when we're talking about contracts, this is a different type of funding than USAID's assistance, which is done through things like grants and cooperative agreements. And these types of awards, they give more discretion to the implementing partner about how to implement the program. About 40% of our funding, less than half of our funding goes through contracts. About 60% of our funding goes through assistance, that more discretionary funding. And when we fund local partners directly, over 80% of the time, this is done through assistance, not contracts. And then small business requirements don't apply to those kinds of rewards. Outside of the contracts and grants, I want to highlight too that a portion of USAID's funding is also dedicated to PIOs like UN agencies or contributions to multilateral funds like the Global Fund. And so that's a little bit different than thinking about tying it to a particular nationality, but it is sort of pots of dedicated funding that are important to the US to fund in the spirit of advancing multilateralism. But with largely untied aid, right, let's ask this question. What holds USAID back from funding more local organizations directly? We have a goal of 25%. We're at about 10% of our funds going to local partners. That's up from the sort of 6 to 7% on average from the decade prior, but it's still pretty far from our 25% goal. So Eshban talked about, the non-legal restrictions that still end up directing aid away from Global South actors. And so that's actually where I'm going to focus today. And let me highlight just a couple of factors. So the first is that USAID and US government funding in general has a preference for full and open competitions. Now, local organizations often have greater knowledge and level of influence in their communities, but they don't have the same experience working with USAID that traditional implementing partners do. Nor do they sometimes have the same organizational infrastructure that's been set up specifically to compete for and win USAID awards. So one of the things that can help address this constraint is limiting competition to local actors. And we recently revised our operational policy to clarify that staff may restrict eligibility for assistance awards to local entities with no extra approvals necessary. So that is, the desire to target local partners is a pre-approved condition for a decision to restrict eligibility. We're working on socializing this flexibility and encouraging peer-to-peer exchanges on how to utilize it more. So another piece of the puzzle is how we support the organizational health of local organizations through support for indirect cost recovery. So indirect costs represent like the expense of doing business that may not be associated with a particular award, but they're necessary for the general operation of an organization. And it can include things like business development, right? And unfortunately, a lot of new and local partners, struggle to fully recover indirect costs, like due to things like the complexity of US government financial requirements and varying levels of our own staff expertise in negotiating budgets that include indirect costs. And so we have been making concentrated efforts to make sure that we can, share this toolkit of solutions geared towards substantially improving the ability of our staff to work with local partners to recover costs in a better way. And I'll also note that we've just had some regulatory changes come down the pike that will raise the minimum rate for indirect cost recovery. We currently have a rate that's, any grantee can have a 10% indirect cost recovery rate, and that's going to be increased to 15%. And I think this will allow more reasonable and realistic indirect cost recovery. Another challenge, though, I'd like to highlight is around USAID's own capacity limitations, right? It takes more staff time to work in locally led ways, to listen, to co-create, to translate documents, to expand communication channels, to guide prospective and current partners who are new to working with USAID, as many local partners are. And also, since local partners often receive smaller awards than large US-based partners that may manage, big, complex awards, it takes more awards to move the same amount of money. And a small award takes about as much time to pull together as a large award. And so staffing plays a key role in meeting our commitment. And we are prioritizing hiring, especially for our acquisitions and assistance staff, but we need continued support from our Congress to be able to do so. So I also want to make a note, and I'll close on this, about commitments to domestic civil society. So USAID does not have specific tied funding commitments to US-based INGOs, but we do recognize that they can have a valuable role in advancing the locally led development agenda, even as we need to redouble our efforts to shift more funding directly to local organizations. So international organizations, they can play a crucial role in things like capacity strengthening and mentoring and coaching of local organizations. And we hear from local organizations who are sub-awardees with INGOs, and they talk about the value of these relationships when they are based in mutuality. INGOs can integrate local actors into international networks and markets, and they can take on donor management functions that don't make sense for local organizations to specialize in, or that they're not interested in specializing in. They can absorb some risk. There's a lot of models for what these relationships can look like. But the emphasis should always be on those relationships, because the goal is to make sure that we're building on the unique expertise, the resources, the knowledge, the networks of all development actors, but doing so in a way that supports and creates the conditions for local actors to take the lead to address local challenges. And so that's why we have these two goals. One is about expanding our direct relationships with local partners, and the other is about how we elevate local leadership across all of our programming. So let me stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's really useful for so many of us to really hear how a bilateral government agency is really thinking this stuff through, what it actually looks like in the different parts of your entity, you know, and not all of it is easy, right? And the obvious solutions aren't always the right ones. So that's fantastic, and really great to hear your perspective on the role of different intermediaries as well, and that emphasis on relationships. So we'll dive into that in the discussion, as you say. Brilliant. Last but not least, Romilly, welcome to the floor. Thank you so much for joining us from Bond. And yeah, really looking forward to your reflections on the UK context and on the provocations that Eshban and Sarah have already shared with us. So dive in.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and brilliant to see more than 200 people on this call. I feel like I've been rattling around the UK NGO sector for more years than I care to remember. And in many of those years, I have been highlighting the downsides of tied aid. So I'm really happy that we're having this conversation and taking it forward. And we all know the downsides of tied aid in terms of value for money, perpetuating harmful stereotypes, undermining ownership and localization. I mean, I think I don't need to make that point to this crowd, and I'm very glad that this conversation is happening. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the experience of UK NGOs and the sort of funding evolution that we've been through as a useful input into this conversation. What's happened in the UK is that there used to be core funding arrangements for NGOs that were called programme partnership arrangements. And they were longer term core funding, as I said. In 2016, the then Department for International Development did a whole review of its funding arrangements for civil society. And what it did is created actually a more competitive bidding process. So I think Sarah was talking about USAID experience. The same thing has happened to the UK. And I think the problem is that it's created a little bit of the worst of all worlds because it's a competitive process, but also some of the mechanisms for civil society funding actually do remain tied. So there's the UK aid match, which is restricted to UK CSOs, and UK aid direct, which is also partially tied. So we've sort of, in a way, gone backwards around the agendas that we wanted to advance. And there are much more stringent transparency and accountability requirements on all of these funding, which has really undermined effectiveness. It's quite interesting that the UK's Independent Commission for Aid Impact, which scrutinises UK aid spending, did quite a big review of DFID funding for civil society in 2019, and they gave it an amber red score, which is not a good score, as you can imagine. And one of the things that they really said is that actually having these more competitive processes and the more stringent requirements, that they did actually reduce opportunities for self-driven capacity development, for longer term strategic thinking, for adaptation to the evolving context, all the things that we know to be incredibly important. And also the application process was very costly, and the sort of very short-term project-based models, and really didn't address some of the issues that Eshban rightly referred to around closing of civic space. So that was something that was particularly highlighted, that the fact that civil society around the world is finding civic space to be closing, but actually these models really didn't help to address that. So it was a pretty damning picture. We then had in the UK a series of scandals in early 2018 around sexual harassment. Now, obviously, that absolutely had to be addressed, and incredibly important work was done by the then Bond team and others across the sector to address those scandals. But I think what also happened is there was a much greater degree of risk aversion on the form of government around some of that funding, and actually also some of the INGOs as well. So that's just another contextual context to bear in mind. We then had, we've all had a really good time in the UK NGO sector. We then had a series of really devastating cuts as a result of the general cuts to UK aid in 2021. And those were managed quite poorly in the sense, extremely poorly actually, in the sense that there was very little transparency, very little predictability, and quite severe cuts were made. And actually remain, in many cases, they've not been reversed. And we've had a sort of series of cuts to the overall aid budget because of refugee spending and the other pressures. So all that is to say, really the direction we've gone in the UK has been in the wrong direction, because what we would like to see is more core funding for UK NGOs as well, to do the public awareness raising, the public engagement, the sort of things that we need to do in the UK context, but particularly for local partners. We want to see more long-term, predictable, flexible core funding. I'm sure many of us on this call would agree with that. Instead, we've got a system of more restricted funding and more, which is partially tied. And a lot of that, to be honest, has been driven from the political context, as I mentioned, the sexual harassment scandals, which, as I say, had to be addressed, incredibly important they were addressed, but actually got whipped up in some ways by some of the kind of critical press that we faced in the UK. We then ended up with a very hostile government that really wanted to undermine our efforts. So I think what we should be doing is thinking about how do we work together. Jenny talked at the beginning a lot about solidarity. How do we collaborate? How do we show solidarity across our communities? So solidarity between civil society in the South and in the global North to help create a much better political context, which will enable us to have the space for that untied, long-term, core, flexible funding that we all really need. So I will stop there, but happy to answer any questions on the UK context as helpful. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Romilly. That was really, really fantastic. Great to sort of be reminded of that recent history in the UK, and obviously I think a lot of that might resonate for some other national contexts right now that are very live. So yeah, really grateful to all three of you for those really fascinating and helpful, and I think very complimentary comments to get us started. So we have over 200 people on the call, and now is our open space to have a chat and a conversation with each other. So in order to manage that well, we're going to have like 20 minutes or so of just, feel free to think about your questions for the speakers, think about questions that you've got for each other or for the RINGO team as a whole, and all your comments. So this is, as we said, the sort of spirit of openness and listening and discussion, and coming up with new and better ideas as to how we convey that solidarity that Romilly's just reminded us of. So please put your hand up in the Zoom, with your Zoom hand, so that, because that helps to order people. And also feel free to put comments in the chat as we go. So I think we're fine to be in gallery view. Actually, I'm not sure I need to be a big head on the screen. Thank you. Great. Who wants to dive in? Any critique, comments, questions for our speakers first off? Please, as I say, put your... Alex, I see your name, your hand first. Thank you. Dive in.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I didn't think I was so fast to be first, but there you go. I wanted to come back to Sarah Rose with a question or so. I work for Christian Aid, and we're an organization that has only recently begun, like in the last year or two, or even, less than a year probably, started to work with USAID. And without having in place a lot of the experience and also knowledge about how to work with USAID on USAID funding, it's been a very steep learning curve. So I would appreciate, perhaps more than people who might have more, have worked with you more, what what it might entail currently. So now you had prefaced, or when you started, you said what you're talking about is a reform agenda or a change, a localization reform agenda. And I was wondering, where would you put yourself on that trajectory? Are you at the start, or, like, for example, if managing programs at the moment is as I am experiencing, which is quite, let's say, management heavy, and there's a lot of data management and very intense data sharing, and also discussions and ongoing conversation, and it's quite intense. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's a lot more effort than, let's say, some other donors that we work with. And I'm just thinking, okay, we might have a little bit of extra capacity to deal with that, but local organizations, I feel, would really struggle, not because of capacity, not because of capability, but because of capacity. And I was just wondering, where are you? Yeah, is it a 5-year journey before, let's say, a version of management, a version of fund management or portfolio management might be such that it might be easier for local organizations? Or is it a 3-year or an immediate scenario?
Thanks so much, Alex. What I'm going to do is take a few questions first, and then we'll pull back, pull in the members of the panel and others to respond to them. So thanks for your question for Sarah, Alex. Dear Kumba, I think you are next.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Apologies all, I'm not putting the camera. It's before 6 a.m. in California. My name is Diakumba Gassama. I work for the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I'm very, very happy and very grateful for this work. I think as a US-based private foundation with no offices anywhere else than here, we have made a commitment to anti-colonial practices. We don't advertise it, but we are trying to learn, and pieces of research like this are really helping us. I think for me, I can just say that it's possible because I hear many people, and thank you, Sarah Rose, for what you said, because I'm based here in the US, so I see a lot of discussions of experts saying that, oh, there's no capacity or capabilities, it's impossible to do. Your administrator even said to Congress that it will take time. But at a very micro level, at the Hewlett Foundation, in the strategy that I work in on inclusive governance, we have made that shift. I found a portfolio 3 years ago that had 75% of funds that were going to INGOs, maybe 10% to the most proximate organization and 15% to some mix. And now we are at 66% going to proximate organization, the most local you can think of, and 34% going to Pan-African or continental and global organizations. So it's an invitation to switch the way most of us think, which is looking at those that we are trying to support as those who lack the capacity, and create environments where they don't have to be the problem, but we are facilitating it for them. I'm sorry, English is my third language. I hope you got it. And really, I want to ask Eshban and the colleagues who worked on the research, RINGO and all, a question that nobody asks you. How did you do this work? Where are the funds for it? Did you feel that the lack of funding for that work has limited what you could say? And we stand in solidarity with you for the consequences of that work. Not everybody thinks it's a threat or something. It's a very valuable work. Thank you.
Kumba, thank you so much for being with us before 6 a.m. And for those supportive comments. We will come back to you in a second. Thank you. Anna Maike, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Jenny. My question is related to something that Eshban said, but it's open to everybody to answer really, is he mentioned something about instead of trying to fight for a seat at the table, why can't we try and build our own? So my question would be to everybody really is, what do you imagine that table to look like? How can we, if we're talking about solidarity, how can we apply that in building that table? Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Anamaike. Julia, I'm gonna go to you next, and then I think we might get some responses. Thank you, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm Julia Zahreddin. I work with Diana EL Consulting, an equity and strategy consultancy firm. I have a question for Sarah about your commitment to community leadership, and how does USAID as a bilateral agency fosters community ownership over the funding process? I know that some may be familiar with participatory grant making practices, some might not. So I'm wondering, how have you worked to try and create accountability to the community? And what does it mean practically for USA to try to foster this bottom-up accountability? Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Great. So we've got a couple of questions for Sarah specifically from Alex and from Julia on community leadership and where you are as USAID on your journey of transformation. And then I'm going to maybe turn to either Eshban or maybe Dylan, who was involved in the report that sits behind the Too Southern to be Funded work to respond to Diakumba, and maybe to the table. What does the table question from Anamaike as well? So Sarah, why don't you go first, and then Dylan or Eshban?
Thank you so much. And thank you for the really thoughtful questions. And these are questions that we are grappling with too. So it's great to be able to have the opportunity to discuss it in this space and with all of you. Alex, thank you for your reflections. And I think they're just, it's so useful to be able to hear your reflections coming from a position of also attempting to work with USAID, because it can be difficult in some ways. The question that you asked is, where are we on our journey? And I think that's a really good question. I think that we are neither at the beginning nor anywhere close to the end. And actually, I hope that this will be a continual journey, because I don't ever see really a finish line of saying, yep, we're good enough in this sense, but it's a continuous process of how can we better ourselves. Again, this isn't new. Administrator Power has, re-elevated this commitment to locally led development, but this is something, that the international community has been talking about for decades, right? And USAID in particular has had a number of sort of specific initiatives or, goals associated with locally led development that we have been pursuing for the last, 10 plus years in a concentrated way. And so to me, sometimes people ask the question of, is this just the same thing in a new package? And the answer is, it is the same objective. And that's an okay thing, because I think the fact that there is this continuity that we've seen over the years really underscores how important this is. And this is continuity, again, across different political administrations in the United States as well. And so where are we on this journey? We are embracing the lessons that we have learned from our past efforts about what are the barriers that local partners face to working directly with USAID, that we need to take a more expansive view and not just look at direct local funding, even though we need to make sure we're paying attention to that as well. And we're using those to be able to move forward. And so, again, as you note, some of the things that we have been able to push through over the last couple of years, again, are based on learning from the past. Like, it's important for us to make sure that we can do our award making process in languages other than English, right? That we need to have translated standard provisions for our awards, so that it's hard enough to understand, in our own native language, in English, what some of these award requirements are. And that's a language that if English speakers speak, right? But if we're talking about someone who's operating in a different language, how can we make that more accessible? We have new platforms, a new platform called workwithusaid.gov, which offers just how-to information. Are you new to USAID? Here's where to start. Here's how you can determine whether, what the steps are to work with USAID. And it's translated into multiple languages as well to help ease that accessibility. We are working on things like making sure that our staff know to require only the minimum reporting requirements. We are working on expanding types of mechanisms that are lower compliance burden and focus more on paying for results rather than a lot of the compliance steps about accounting for every dollar that was spent. But it is a journey, right? We have 12,000 people at USAID as well, and thinking about how to continue to expand sort of knowledge, understanding, embrace of some of these different kinds of flexibilities, while also continuing to try to identify places for new flexibilities, is something that we are going to continue to do. And I hope that we can just keep the burner on as we continue to advance this. Dyakumba, I appreciate so much your reflections and the demonstration case that you presented in terms of Hewlett being able to shift its portfolio to local actors in a relatively short period of time. And I think those demonstrations are really important and it help counter that perspective that it's hard or that it's risky. I would say USAID's programs focused on HIV under PEPFAR have been another demonstration case. They have been working on this for longer. Since 2018, they have been working in a very concerted way to shift their funding to local partners. But in these last 6 years, we've almost doubled approved funding going to local partners from about 500 million in 2018 to over $1 billion in 2024 projected, right? And they've more than doubled the number of local partners they were working with, from 73 to now over 200. And so it can be done. It takes some time, and we just need to keep at it as well. Julia, really good question about how does USAID think about community ownership over grant making? That's a great question. As I said, one of our goals is to think about how do we make sure that we are emphasizing local leadership over design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. When that sort of target and goal was handed down, we didn't have a way to measure that or to think about what that really meant in sort of a systematic kind of way. And so we went through a process of asking a lot of people, right? Stakeholders from the Global South who are and are not working with USAID. We talked to our international partners. We talked to our own staff to hear what are the kinds of things that we as USAID can do to really meaningfully and visibly sort of elevate local leadership and voices and priorities through all of these parts of the process. And through that process, we heard a number of things that really emerged as important. One of the things that emerged was, again, the desire for more direct local funding, but it also emerged about the importance of things like co-creation processes. Instead of USAID coming to the table with a pre-baked award, how can we join with either communities or local partners to jointly identify how activity design should look? And then during the implementation phase, can we continue to co-create work plans along the way? So we're constantly having that input and leadership of local organizations in what the work actually looks like. Thinking about the importance of things like listening tours, participatory monitoring, evaluation, and learning practices. Who defines what results are important? And approaches like that. And so we are now just starting to systematically track, through all of our programs, a set of 14 good practices. It may change. We just did a pilot. We are learning from the pilot and figuring out what makes most sense. But we're talking about what are these 12 to 14 good practices that we can track to see if we're doing them as part of our programs to really help underscore the value of things like these co-creative and participatory approaches that we are doing. But by tracking them, we really elevate their value and create new space for conversations among staff about, is there space to do this in the award that we're putting forward now? So let me stop there.
Brilliant, Sarah. I think there's lots of appetite to hear exactly how those processes are playing out in USAID. Thank you. So Dylan, I'm just going to ask you to come in response to Dyakumba's sort of solidarity in this work and questions in that space, and then Eshban to come in after you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. So in answer to Dyakumba's question, the simple answer is that the funding that in effect covered the entire development of the research, the design, and of course the campaign that the Global Fund for Community Foundations launched, at least from our perspective, is from core funds. And I want us to think about what that has meant. For core funds is precious. It's gold dust. We all know that. And it's been liberating for us. We have a small number of foundations that provide core or unrestricted funding to us. And that has enabled us to be able to take risks, to be able to do some unpopular things, and to be able to respond immediately to opportunities and also respond to challenges in the system. And this is, I think, the most perfect example of how we were able to respond very, very quickly to what we saw as an opportunity to really shift the dial around funding for local actors. We didn't have to write a proposal. We didn't have to wait 6 months for a donor to think about whether or not they wanted to fund us. We didn't have to shoehorn our idea into someone else's logical framework, produce any sort of metrics. We just could make a decision. And we are a global North organization. Imagine how difficult it is for global South organizations to just do the work that they want to do. So it is absolutely liberating to have that unrestricted funding. And so we are, of course, we're talking about tied aid here and about direct funding, but it's also about the flexibility that comes with that funding. So in answer to one of the earlier questions, it's the quality as well. We have to break down the system that we have right now so that we do have direct funding, but we also have to make sure it's good quality funding. So for us, from our perspective, and I'll hand over to Eshban, we were able to do that quickly. I don't think we would have gone to another donor because that would have delayed things considerably, and also we would have been beholden to particular donors' framing of the issue. And I'm sure we would have had our hands tied. This is a provocative campaign, and the research we knew was going to be provocative as well. So I guess this is my way of saying to all of us around this big virtual table, we all have to advocate for better quality funding, because I can see how liberating and how important it has been for Peace Direct, and it'll be tenfold that, 100-fold that for Global South organizations who barely get the opportunity to get that kind of funding. Eshban, over to you.
Yeah, perhaps I'll just add that I think that one of the ways in which this campaign was
on the agenda to...
I'll just add that one of the ways in which this campaign was resourced was really, really through movement generosity. There are many, like I wasn't politely exaggerating earlier when I said it would take a long time to list everybody. There were many organizations that came together to make this campaign come to life, and that all of them brought their resources in whatever forms. And really, I think that we refer to that as movement generosity. We had friends in Brazil who translated the open letter. We had people who came in and offered their expertise to create some of the graphics that you are seeing. So I would say that that's one of the ways in which this campaign was resourced, really through movement generosity. On the question of the table, from our vantage point as the Global Fund, we see many organizations and many people that are not able to play by the rules of the international development system, meaning, they can't speak English or French. They don't have relationships in the Global North. They don't speak the jargon or the development speak that we've all become very good at. So because of that, there's no room for them at the so-called table. And I think that as a result of being locked out of that international aid system, the result is for them to turn to each other or to turn to their communities as a way of raising resources and doing the civil society organizing work that they want to do. And in many ways, part of that alternative table is really communities showing up as active co-funders of their own civil society work. It's a really long conversation about building an alternative because the current system, I think it has its rules that has locked out so many individuals, and that building an alternative system is not something we do because we think it's cool, but we're doing it out of necessity. Otherwise, we would have, wanted to be at the current table. But yeah, I think that it's become something that has to be done out of necessity because there's no room at the current table.
Thanks, Eshban. Beto and Anne, you've been very patient, so I'm going to turn the floor to you. Beto, apologies for mispronunciation. Please go ahead. And then Anne.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm on the phone. I was a bit distracted. Actually, my question is related to this last sentence of Ashban. So I'm from Brazil, and last year we launched a collective impact ecosystem for mental health promotion. We decided to do that after some years in which the CSOs here were fighting for the same source of funding, and we decided to build this collective impact in order to be more prepared, in order to assess international grants. Actually, my question is to the funders. How do they see these collective impact applications, if this is common in their practice, and if they support the development of this kind of model in order to assist the local CSO's development?
Wonderful, great question. Thanks, Victor. Anne, please go ahead and share your question, and then Nana.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, there's two of you, but go ahead. Thank you. You're fine.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm just going to close that other one then. Sorry about that.
No, that's cool. Okay, you're perfect.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for taking my question. It's directed at Sarah Rose, please. I'm a journalist with Development Today Journal based out of Oslo. I'd like to bring this back to the issue of tide aid. And in the Too Southern to Be Funded report, it focuses on the 2001 OECD recommendations on untying aid and points out that those recommendations exempted civil society support. And the report calls this a loophole in those recommendations, and calls for a discussion about that loophole, presumably, whether it should be closed. So my question to Sarah Rose and to the others, if they would like to contribute as well, is, do you think that a rethinking of the 2001 OECD recommendation on untying aid would increase pressure on donors to make more funding available to South-based CSOs? And if I may, I reported on the Too Southern to Be Funded report, and I did a small survey asking Nordic NGOs what they thought about this call for, calling this untied aid, or calling this tied aid and rethinking the 2001 recommendations. And I was interested that many of them object to using the tied aid terminology for CSO support, because they say that takes the discussion in the wrong direction, since tied aid specifically refers to procurement. So mainly for Sarah Rose, but also for others if they would like to step in. Thank you so much for taking my question.
Thanks, Anne. That's really provocative and helpful. Yeah, great. We'll come back to that in a second. I'm going to take Nana and then Ring, and then we'll go back to the panel. But go ahead, Nana.
Thank you, Jenny. I wanted to hear more from colleagues from Sweden about some of the concerns, and I'm hoping that we would get some of us who are working from that space to speak to what the issues are, because I think this is a good space to raise the issues, and I believe that we want to deal with this in solidarity as global civil society from the different parts of the world, and therefore we have to understand what the key issues are and how to address it, and the discussion around the definition of tied aid may be one of them. But I think for us, this was quite clear from the beginning that when we were looking at aid, there was this aspect that was tied to or closed and excluded a huge number of organizations, particularly from the Global South, from accessing aid from certain countries. So yeah, that was the definition. I also wanted to speak to the question on how did some of the processes like RINGO get funded. And I want to add my voice to the movement generosity example that Eshban gave. I think that from the very beginning, we had a number of those who were part of the social lab so very often they had to, invest time into it. They were not being paid for that. Core team members of RINGO had to donate, work, do the work without being paid for a long time before we started getting funding. But also we had funders who came in who were willing to take the risk to say, we don't know what the outcomes are going to be, but we want to believe that this is important to invest in systems change, and we are going to give you the funding to begin the work that needed to be done. So I think all these things are very important, and we need more funders, more donors to be looking at that and investing in some of these system change processes, because I think we know a number of these processes that are unfortunately having to close down or because they are not getting the resources that they need. And RINGO itself is looking to get more resources to do what needs to be done. So let's have more investment and support going towards this as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nana. Nana is the executive director of WAXI, which leads the RINGO project. So thanks for that, Nana. Ring, I'm going to give you the last word from the floor for now, just because we will need to just hear back from some of the panel before wrapping up. So we will have, of course, more time after this call. So after the half hour, we'll move into extra time. So if you want to stay on for extra time, you're most welcome. But Ring, yeah, go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much, Madam Jenny. Actually, I'm very interested and also wonderful to hear from many people, especially from Sarah Rose. And this is my second time to meet her online. Actually, I've been eagerly following up what USAID is doing on localization, especially basing on the statement that was, said by Madame Samantha, the administrator of USAID, in November 2022. She mentioned clearly that they have already started in Latin America this localization initiative, and then later on they will move to Africa. So I want to know what is happening in Africa within the USAID concerning that, a statement that we heard from Madam Samantha last 2 years. That's one question. And then the second one is all about localization. Also, the target is very ambitious, 25 to 30, at least I think maybe before 2030. I want to hear from Madam Sarah, how far have they gone now within that target? Over.
Thank you so much, Ring. I'm going to just bring in some other commentary then. So in response to some of those questions, Romilly, I'm going to call on you first. Maybe the question around the sort of the DAC provision, the Untying Aid commitment, and how you see that playing out, being relevant or not to the civil society funding context in particular, but anything else you want to comment on as well, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. Just 2 points. I mean, absolutely, I think the DAC recommendation should be extended to include civil society as well, because otherwise I think there's a bit of a risk of sort of, we've been very vocal. Many of us have been very vocal on untying around other forms of spending, and I think the same should apply to us. It's not going to be enough, though, because we also need to address all the issues that have been raised throughout today on accessibility, language, bureaucracy, log frames, all these sorts of things. So I think it needs to be both and we do, to go back to the point on sort of political context, we do need to work together to make sure that we've got a wider level of political support that would enable countries and donors to take the level of risk or to feel comfortable about what they perceive to be the risks around some of the core funding. So I think creating a more favourable political environment will enable them to feel much more comfortable about that we get untied long-term core funding. And I think we really need to work together around that, as I was saying. The other point I wanted to come back to, one of the earlier questions, is around sort of what does it mean to have a new table? Eshban talked about building own table. And I think there's some quite interesting work that colleagues from across the bond membership have done of sort of saying, let's look at what the UK's role is on the kind of international system, and what are the areas that we as UK civil society organisations need to be really focusing on in the UK. And one of the good examples is debt. You know, a lot of the contracts are held under, a lot of the private sector debt contracts are held under UK law. So for us as UK civil society, I think a real solidarity is to say we're going to address that, because that's something that we can do specifically in the UK. We don't want to be, you know, gatekeepers or controlling funding that's going to the global south. That has to be local organisations in the global south doing that. But our role in the north is to, in the UK particularly, is to address the issues like debt, like tax transparency, anti-corruption efforts, all of those sorts of things. So I think that's what solidarity looks like, and I think hopefully that's what we can get towards in the future years. But thank you.
Great, thanks, Romilly. Sarah, I think you've had a couple of questions directed to you, and then I've also I have Vivica who would like to come in from Swedish CEDA, which would be great to quickly hear from you. And perhaps Eshban wants to make a couple of final comments. So Sarah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Let me just respond quickly to a couple of them. Beto, I liked your question about collective impact. You know, we actually see, you know, collective impact and collective action sort of at our program level, you know, regularly, all the time. I guess the trick is really to make sure that neither the donor nor an international implementing partner is sort of acting as the backbone organization for that, because having that local backbone, sort of spine of the collective action activity is really essential for a long-term success, right? Because, you know, we also have to be a little bit careful about, you know, our role and influence as the US government and as a donor, because we don't want our role as part of that support to, you know, undermine social movements or local civic actors, but at the same time are looking for ways that we can, in fact, be supportive. Ring, thank you for your question about Africa and what are we seeing here, and what are we talking about with the Africa localization initiative that the administrator announced a couple of years ago. And you know, the goal of that initiative is really to think about how can we increase direct funding to African organizations and expand local leadership in our work there. I would note that, you know, right now, Africa as a region is sort of in the lead of USAID's efforts to fund local partners directly. A lot of that is led by, again, our HIV work through PEPFAR. And so part of what the emphasis is how can we sort of internally help to encourage that to expand into other sectors, into things like agriculture, into things like democracy and governance, to think about how we can do that more broadly. And so part of that is looking at sector diversity. Part of it is also looking at being more intentional about what are the kinds of organizations with which we are working, and seeing if we can be a bit more deliberate about tracking partnerships with organizations that are either led by or, you know, in service of, you know, marginalized or underrepresented groups. So a lot of it is an internal process about how do we get more sort of, you know, resources, et cetera, to some of those, you know, our USAID missions in Africa that are doing this work to be able to support their efforts to be locally led. But there will be more information on tracking what that looks like coming out soon. More broadly, you asked about where is USAID on its on its localization efforts. And I'm pleased to report that, well, unfortunately, I wish I could say that our 2023 progress report is out right now and I could just drop a link into the chat. It should be out in the next week or so. And so hopefully we'll be able to have more of a conversation about all that data when that's out soon. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Vivica, would you like to just share a couple of things from your perspective from the Swedish CEDA dimension? We've heard a few references to the context in Sweden through the call. So yeah, I was keen to give you a little bit of space to come in on that.
Thank you.
We have only 5 minutes left of the formal call.
Thank you, Jenny. I had a hard time finding the raise my hand button. I don't know where it went. It's gone. Anyway, I would just like to respond very briefly to some of the questions that were raised in the chat. Yes, as you probably have heard, the Swedish government decided to untie or stop earmarking the Swedish CSO strategy to only be accessible for Swedish CSOs. And this happened in February. The CSO strategy has been in existence since the 70s in Sweden, and it has always been explicitly ring-fenced or earmarked to Swedish civil society organizations. So this came as a surprise, one could say, for us in February. And now we have been commissioned by the Swedish government to elaborate a new system, which we think would be appropriate to use in the future. But I also would like to underline that the CSO strategy is only part of what CEDA does with civil society organizations. CEDA is supporting civil society organizations in almost all of our thematic, geographic, and global strategies. So in total, of the CEDA's budget per year, 43% of it goes to civil society organizations. Anyway, I'm hoping that this could be a good step in the right direction to better support local civil society in their own right as independent development actors, as Sweden has committed to several international agendas, such as the DAC recommendation on enabling civil society, and also on the donor statement on supporting locally led development. And I hope this is the beginning of a process. It will for sure take a while, but I hope in the end we will be positioned to give more direct support, flexible, long-term, predictable support to local civil society organizations and actors, which is the aim, after all, of all of this that we're here to do. So that is a brief report from where we are at the moment in Sweden and in the civil society unit at CEDA. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I can feel that we could have a whole other hour discussing that, but we have to hold ourselves back. So we don't have many minutes of the formal call altogether left. So Janet, I see your hand up, but if I could just urge you to stay on the call afterwards, we will have that extra 15 minutes. I'm just going to see whether Eshpan would like to say anything to end, and then hand the floor to Charles to thank and close.
Really, I have nothing to add except to repeat a little bit of what I've already said, which is that, you know, civic space is shrinking around the world, and I think that it's going to become increasingly harder for us to move the international funds that we're sometimes beefing over, and that we need to make some very serious investments into what's already there and local civil society so that they can mobilize the local resources that will hold local civil society when those international flows are no longer there. I think that that's the thing that's constantly in my head and in my heart around how to support local civil society in a more long-term way.
Thank you, Eshpan. thanks to everyone for a really rich conversation. Charles, I'm just going to hand over to you for closure. So Charles is a key member of the WAXI RINGO team. So thanks, Charles.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I think a lot has been said. What a wonderful conversation. I think one of the things that I got from all the speakers is, you know, this conversation has been going on for a while, but these are very important times. These are really crucial times for us all, very complex. But there's one thing that's clear, for things to change and for organizations to be resilient in the majority world, they need funding, they need support, they need a lot of direct funding, not just funding, but also flexible and funding that is of good quality. And then, of course, funders need to look at how they engage with local organizations, simplify their processes, look at how they can co-create with them, enable local organizations to make decisions, not just about implementation, but from conception throughout the whole project cycle. So there's a lot there. There's a lot that's been said already. And for all of us at RINGO, we're really excited about this campaign. I think it's a very, very important campaign. And so I think I'll encourage everyone to push this agenda, very important at this time. And I think it's an opportunity for us, all the things that are happening around us, including the CEDA call. It's an opportunity for all of us to engage and to influence so that if initiatives like what is happening in CEDA can be done effectively and done well, and it benefits all of us, whether we're in the global south or in the global north. So thanks everyone for making it. Really love the inputs, and let's keep on advocating for untying aid. Thank you so much. We will definitely share all the conversations in the chat, which were extremely rich, and also the survey findings. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Great, thanks so much, Charles. And yeah, just to encourage those of you who can to stay on for another 15 minutes if you want to carry on the conversation. Before we close this formal bit, I just wanted to shout out to Alex Martins, who's on this call, who actually wrote the really brilliant content that is behind this campaign, working closely with Peace Direct and with Eshban and the wider team. So yeah, kudos to you, Alex. You've really done a good thing there. And so we will be sending round a survey, post-meeting survey, and we will also be sharing with you a sort of edited version of the chat, because there has been so much going on in that chat throughout this call. So thanks to our speakers so much, Romilly, Sarah and Eshban, and to all of you for this brilliant engagement. We really enjoyed it. So those of you who have to leave, please feel free to do so. But we'd love you to stay if you can. So we'll just take a few minutes to see that transition happening. And thanks, huge thanks to everyone. Really great to be together. Go well. Great. So those who are leaving, and those who are staying, we will just take a moment to see how many of us there are. For those who are staying, that's wonderful. I wonder whether if you have what we can do with this space of the sort of next 15 minutes is we can divide up into little huddles, virtual huddles, and talk about particular dimensions or questions that that we feel passionately about, or that we want to sort of explore with other people. So if you have a strong view on what you'd like to speak about, or if you'd like a little breakout room set up, please just tell us in the chat, and we can do that. Fifi and Nancy can send you into a breakout room with colleagues to discuss a particular issue. So yeah, feel free, just pop that in the chat. but until that becomes clear, I'm just going to maybe continue the main conversation and go to Janet, who's just disappeared. Have you just disappeared, Janet? Janet Mumo was patiently waiting with her hand up and now I think has gone. Ah, shame. But we have Jean-Jacques, is it Capagni, who also has your hand up. So Jean, please feel free to speak out. Hi, welcome. I mean, not welcome, but welcome to the floor. Welcome to asking the question. Go ahead.
Allô?
Hello, Jean. Go ahead.
Ok, je suis Moreau Jean-Jacques. Je parle français, hein. Je suis Moreau Jean-Jacques, je viens de la Côte d'Ivoire. Je suis membre du conseil d'administration d'une ONG appelée ONG Solfèvre, dont les domaines d'intervention sont dans le cadre du VIH-Sida, la tuberculose et puis le paludisme. Maintenant, concernant le VIH-Sida, nous recevons un appui par USAID, mais ce n'est pas un appui direct, mais un appui indirect par USAID concernant le VIH-Sida pour les enfants atteints de VIH-Sida et puis leur famille aussi. Maintenant, l'une des choses que je voulais proposer, c'est que est-ce qu'on peut avoir une plateforme de discussion, soit ça peut être sur WhatsApp, tout ça, pour des projets qu'on peut élaborer dans les pays pour que ces pays puissent parvenir aussi au développement. Puisque vous avez signifié quelque chose, on a le financement des projets de certains pays, mais le problème, c'est que ces projets-là ne sont pas durables dans le temps. Quand le bailleur finit de financer le projet, c'est sur 3 ans, 4 ans, le projet ne peut pas à lui seul être autonome. C'est-à-dire quoi? Ce projet ne peut pas. C'est celui qui a reçu le financement, il faut qu'il soit à mesure de pouvoir continuer le projet sans que même le bailleur ne puisse l'appuyer. Donc, on peut voir ensemble quels sont les projets qui sont probants au niveau de chaque pays. Et l'une des choses aussi que vous voulez signifier au niveau de l'USAID, il faut qu'ils associent aussi les organisations de la société civile concernant les projets qui doivent être menés dans les différents pays. Parce que ce sont les ONG locales qui maîtrisent mieux le terrain, qui maîtrisent mieux les populations aussi, afin que leurs projets aussi soient des projets durables. Parce qu'on se tourne vers nos gouvernements, mais nos gouvernements sont plus dans les bureaux, ils n'ont pas la maîtrise de ce qui se passe sur le terrain. Donc, merci à vous et nous prions Dieu que le contact encore soit ouvert. S'il peut y avoir des cas d'échange, des plateformes WhatsApp qu'on puisse échanger, ça serait préférable aussi. Parce qu'on a beaucoup d'idées, on a beaucoup de projets qu'on pourrait vous mettre à disposition et puis voir ensemble ce qui est faisable. Merci.
Merci, Jean-Jacques. My French is rusty, but I think I got the gist of that. But I'm gonna call on my colleague Jim from the Waxy RINGO team to
Jenny, I don't think we can hear you.
Ah, really?
I can hear you. If you switch?
I think it might be because you might
interpretation.
still be on the English channel.
You need to go back. So to hear
Thank you.
Jean-Jacques, I think many of us switched to the English, but now we need to switch back to original.
Okay. Tickle yourselves.
So Jenny, you were calling on Jim.
Yeah.
Is Jim still on the call?
Yes, I'm on the call.
I wonder if you would like to respond in French, but also I just want to highlight that Dylan highlighted in the chat that there's Kujulink. So Dylan, do you want to speak a little bit to that?
Sure. I mean, I'm only sort of familiar with the Adesso's work around this, not the detail of Kujulink, but I think the point that Jean-Jacques was raising is a really critical one, which is that there's an information deficit in the entire ecosystem. If you think about the ecosystem of local actors, whether in development, humanitarian, or peace building globally, there's an enormous gap between the knowledge that they have and the knowledge of their communities and the knowledge and the understanding from international donors. And that knowledge gap is being bridged, I think, quite poorly by INGOs. So the INGOs place themselves as the trusted intermediaries to say, we know best. We know the organizations to work with. We know those contexts. And actually, look, Peace Direct is an INGO, but we want to be able to do ourselves out of business because actually we believe that the role of the INGO is to actually shrink and to do ourselves out of a job and allow the local organizations to be able to access that funding directly. That's going to take some time. And what we can do as INGOs and others, other allies, is to be able to shrink that information gap. So when Jean-Jacques talks about the work that he wants to do, I think Adesso, led by Degan Ali, some of you who know Degan Ali, is trying to do precisely that, is trying to say, how can we have a platform that enables donors to meet directly, engage directly with organizations that absolutely know what they want to do in their communities? Now, of course, in order to do that well, Kujalink would have to have a very sophisticated network to be able to collect all that information. And I'm sure that it'll take time to develop. But I also wanted to say that there are other ways that this can be done. So for any of the INGOs in the room, I would argue that it is also partly our responsibility to lift up the voices and the work of others, not lift our own voice up. It's been the 50 years of INGOs promoting themselves. It's about time that they promote others. They should have been doing that a long time ago. And so, for example, for the last 10 or 15 years, we've been mapping. We do something called mapping, which is just identifying amazing organizations that are worthy of support. We don't fund some of them because we don't have the capacity or the resources ourselves, but it is our job to lift up those voices and those organizations and hopefully then become a connector. So we talk a lot about the roles that INGOs can play. One of them is to be a connector, just to be a connector and a broker and then step out of the way so that people like Jean-Jacques and his organization can actually get the funding that they need without being mediated through INGOs as well. So there are things that INGOs can do to be those connectors and those brokers, but we should resist the temptation of then being the grant manager, because what tends to happen is we say, oh, well, we'll manage the funds because we know how to do it. Well, we don't need to, actually. We need to stop that, break that cycle and say that funding can go directly, even if it is a bit difficult at first, and even if it is a bit complex. I think we have to start that process because it is, as the report showed, the system is so skewed against local organizations. It's embarrassing. So I'll stop ranting and I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much, Dylan. Can you hear me now? All good?
Yes.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Jean-Jacques, for that question and Dylan for that response. Just looking in the chat, I've seen that Carolyn and Abdul Kamara are connecting on the question of funding for capacity building for local NGOs. I don't know if you'd like a quick breakout room for you guys and anybody else who wants to join you to just connect, or is it sufficient that you've made the connection on in the chat? Let us know. And if anyone else has any points that they'd want to make or share or proposition for further follow-up conversations with others, then please do put your hands up or say so in the chat. This is your space for the last 5 minutes. Yeah, Carolyn, go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's a really great honor to be here. I've listened keenly, taking notes and connecting with people. My question was specifically on capacity building because as we have heard many a times when local actors, local NGOs, CSOs request for funding, they're told, oh, you cannot apply for that, you can't go for that because you don't have the capacity to manage that grant. You have to work under an international NGO. And one of the things that I have taken upon myself and with my organization, the NGO Whisperer Center for Social Impact, is to provide that capacity building to local actors, to smaller organizations. And that's what we do. We have a 6-month global fellowship program. And Ring was actually one of our global fellows, and I see a number of them here. We've built their capacity. One of the things, and that's why I posed the question there, was, where can we get funding to strengthen these capacities? Because donors would say, oh, you're doing an amazing work. The organizations you're working with are excellent. But when we ask them for funding to support us to do this work so we can build their capacity, they say, no, we only fund projects. We won't fund you to build their capacity, but we want them to come to us with that capacity. So I'm finding myself funding this global fellowship program and a lot of things that we're doing at the NGO Whisperer with my own money and a few other private sector funders who are interested in funding us. But the very organizations that are saying, or the funders who are saying, oh, wow, we want to work with local actors in the global south, they say, no, we don't have money for capacity building. So my question is, where can we get the money to do this capacity building so they can be ready for these international donors who are wanting to work with local actors who apparently don't have the capacity? It's like a chicken and egg situation. That's my dilemma, and I'm putting it on the table. And I would be honored to continue this discussion with Ringo and be part of this conversation going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Well, not brilliant. I mean, it's really tough. And I can see lots of people nodding and sort of standing in solidarity with you on that. So I think there's lots of experience on the call. We will definitely follow up. Nana, dive in, and then we have...
No, I think Caroline, I mean, what you're saying resonates. I mean, as a capacity development institution, WACC has, this is why we are part of this campaign. So I'm glad that you are ready to join us. And what I had wanted to say was that our colleagues, the GGCFC and Peace Direct, who are leading the 2000 to be funded campaign, I think would provide more information for those who want to be part of this, because we really need to build solidarity and work together to push this campaign and make it successful. So I think as much information as we could have on how people could be a part of it in one way or the other would be very useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Nana. Beto, go ahead, and then Dylan.
That was an amazing statement. Actually, when I asked about the percentage of unrestricted grants, I meant to just if there is a percentage that currently could be used for capacity building in CSO, because we are having these discussions with some funders here. So we started this ecosystem actually to improve the quality of the local CSOs. But when we are discussing the funding, they say, okay, so these investments must be linked to a specific project. So say, this is not supporting the development of local CSOs. And they reply to us, say, okay, so name us a percentage in which you feel that it's interesting for implement into this capacity building for the CSOs. I don't know if there is any data around that.
Thanks, Peter. I think people will maybe respond to you in the chat if they have that data. Dylan, do you have anything to add on that, as well as I know you had your hand up previously as well?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I just wanted to respond to Carolyn's point about the scarcity of funding. I agree, and we would all agree that there's a scarcity of funding, the right type of funding for CSOs globally. But I would also say that we've got to be mindful of how we are framing capacity building. And most of you will know this already. You know, it's a very contested term. When we consulted Global South actors 4 years ago, they were very hostile and very frustrated at the constant reference to capacity building. They said, why is it that we still hear the same framing of capacity building as if we lack capacity? You know, they asked, what capacity do we lack? Do we lack the capacity to understand our own communities? Do we lack the capacity to do the work? No, what the capacity that they're talking about, the donors are talking about, is the capacity to manage a particular type of grant and manage a particular type of financial transaction. It's not actually about the capacity to do the good work on the ground. And so I think one of the messages that we have been trying to send through our, some of you may be aware of our work, Time to Decolonize Aid report that came out about 3 years ago, was actually we need to push back at this sort of this incessant fixation on capacity building, because actually that's part of the problem. I'm not suggesting in any way that there is training and development is not needed. We all need training and development, all of us. But actually, what we do need is to stop, I think, using that framing, because it can unintentionally, I think, reinforce the notions that there is a lack of capacity. And we really have to move away from that. The whole sort of decolonizing aid agenda is about actually saying, Global South have agency, they know that they have connections, they have knowledge, they have expertise, and that's the most important thing. And it's actually for Global North organizations to bend to their rules, and in breaking their rules, to be able to fund those organizations, not trying to lift, somehow these Global South organizations to become mini INGOs in the image of the World Bank or other big, institutions that have all the sophisticated mechanisms for managing risk. That's not what we should be doing. And by the way, the last thing to say is that, all of the Global South actors that we have consulted with said, it's not like they said, of course, we know we have a lot to learn. We want to learn, as do we in the Global North. But the deficit thinking that we have in the sector right now means that we start off with an assumption that there is not the capacity in those organizations, and that's what we have to tackle. We have to stop that narrative. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. Carolyn, I think you've kicked off a really interesting sub-conversation. I can see that in the chat you've made some great connections with other participants as well. So hopefully that will run, and there's a little sub-community there who are interested in exploring that area of interest from both perspectives that you've raised and that Dylan has just added to. So we need to close the call soon, but I want to just give a quick word to Akio and to Alex, and I think then we need to wrap up and close. But Akio, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
Perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm Akio from Japan. And I was really interested in all the discussions today, and I'd like to thank you all for this. But one point I'd like to make, I of course agree with all the points that Dylan has made, but we have been really talking about capacity building for 40 or 50 years, and maybe some people might question, so what we have all been doing, all the donors or the ICSOs have been doing, if we have to really say the same things over and over for 40 or 50 years. But the other question, I wrote this briefly in the chat, is of course the issue of who is really defining capacity from whose perspective. So because of time, I will just stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect, Akio. And actually the point that Nana has made in the chat as well, I think at exactly the same time as you were speaking it out. So yeah, who's defining and what are the expectations and the sort of systemic demands, and is that appropriate? Thank you very much. Alex, very fitting that you should have the last word.
Oh my gosh, is
Go
it
ahead.
fitting? I don't know. Thank you so much. Really quickly, Oi Beto, just to respond to Beto, and then also picking up on all of these points. I mean, whatever we call it, capacity, I agree with all the points about, it's us in the Global North that need to build our capacity, because if we've been funding this for so long and there's still no change, isn't the problem here. But I just want to highlight the figure that's in the report that I put in the chat. It's hard for the campaign to land lots of different messages. So we've gone with the message of less than 10% of funding goes to Global South-based organizations. But guess how much of that is core funding, which I think is what we're all talking about here. It's 1%. It's 1%. Sorry, I get angry because it is, to Eshpan's point earlier, it's about, solidarity and dignity. And how can we say that we're truly interested in development if we're giving 1% of core funding to organizations who are already based in their context and know exactly what to do, and if they had the money, they could do it now? And just to bring that back to some of the points that were raised earlier around whether we should, when it comes back to the boring recommendation stuff on untying aid, of course, Global North organizations are afraid of us calling their core funding tied, because it's gold dust. Core funding is the money everybody wants. However, think about that 1%. That's all we're saying. If you're going to untie, let it be everyone that can access that gold dust, right? That's all, the only point that we're trying to make. Thanks.
Brilliant. What a good wrap up. Thank you, Alex. And a sort of call to action, isn't it? It's a reminder of the imperative for all of us to keep driving on this issue. Thank you, everyone, for a really rich conversation, both in the formal meeting and in this after chat. Really enjoyed it, and what a great community to be a part of. It's a real privilege. So thank you so much, everyone. We will close the call now, but let's keep the conversation going. And please join us for our next community gathering as Ringo and friends, whenever that may be. I can't remember. Somebody can shout out if they know, but if not, we will just say thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
All take